In this conversation, we're going to take you back a few decades here in the United States. There's an interesting new book that's been published called Course of Action by the late James Lerner, and its co-editor, Anna Marie Taylor, joins me here today. Anna Marie, thanks for talking with us.
Glad to be here.
And the subtitle of the book is a long one, A Journalist's Account from Inside the American League Against War and Fascism and the United Electrical Workers Union, the UE, from 1933 to 1978. And to explain people the connection, James Lerner is your partner's father. He passed away about 10 years ago, and he worked for many years as a labor journalist. And people have to kind of scratch their heads a little bit because that category doesn't exist anymore, Anna Marie. I knew Paul Shinoff, who was the last beat reporter assigned to labor in San Francisco newspapering, and that gig ended in the early 1990s. So tell me a little bit about James Lerner, and before we get into the book, just his personal story and how his job really was to report for a labor publication on the labor movement in this country.
Well, James Lerner actually was born into a labor family. His parents came over from Russia as immigrants in the early 20th century. His father was 18 years old. Within a couple of months, he got a job as an artisan in a leather factory that made leather suitcases by hand. And he found himself on strike within the first 2 months on the job and in jail for struggling against scabs at the time. Actually, they won their issues. However, that's the ambience in which Jim grew up. But if we go to the point where Jim actually joined UE News, which was in 1940, he had previously been a journalist in his 20s for the magazine of the American League Against War and Fascism, and he wrote a column called Youth Speaks.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's delve into that a little bit. And in a moment, I want people to understand that one of the critical issues that James Lerner reported on was the investigation and prosecution of General Electric for its collusion with Germans during World War II. But I was fascinated by the early descriptions of these active political groups starting in the 1920s, the communists, the socialists, and then he was involved with the American League Against War and Fascism. That's a mouthful. And I had not really heard much about that group before. And it appears that they kind of shared some common interests with socialists and communists, but had their own mission and direction. So can you tell us a little bit more about the League?
I can. One of the amazing things about the League, and it only existed for 10 years before the outbreak of the Second World War, was that it was this enormous coalition of everybody from the Communist Party to national pacifist organization, farm groups, student groups. And Jim at one point talks about going into a League meeting and noting that it was like going into a who's who of people who were in the forefront of advocating for unemployment, Social Security.
Jim writes here that, as you mentioned, there were many prominent people. Lincoln Steffens, the journalist, novelist John Dos Passos, the garment workers union leader Charles Zimmerman, also a professor from the University of Wisconsin, William Ellery Leonard, and Roger Baldwin, executive secretary of the ACLU, and Earl Browder, who was executive secretary of the Communist Party.
So the League was a broad coalition. They had chapters all over the country, including in the Bay Area, which he talks about in his book. And that's probably something that could be a lesson for today.
When I read about the League, it really struck me how many of these same issues are here today. We just came out of what is called the Great Recession. It was a depression for people who lost their homes or who were unemployed for 2 years or more.
That's very true, and I hope people who are interested in that issue will look at Jim's book. There was the anti-war part of the League, and then there was the anti-fascism part of the League. There was a great reluctance throughout this country to get involved in the war in Europe. So that was part of what the League was doing at that time, was their anti-war activities. But there also was a growing knowledge of the fascist movement in Germany, Italy, Spain. And short of actually advocating that the U.S. get involved, a lot of the activities of the League had to do with getting information out to people about the growth of fascism. They organized huge boycotts, such as the famous silk boycott of Japanese silk, because at that time, 85% of Japanese silk was being purchased in the U.S., and women were having demonstrations in which they were not wearing silk stockings, refused to wear any kind of silk. They also organized boycotts of German ships that would come into U.S. ports, and had a very successful demonstration in Baltimore in 1935 in which they actually turned around a so-called goodwill Nazi warship. The city of Baltimore had actually prepared quite an extravagant reception, and there was so much protest organized by the League that the ship left.
And also on the anti-war front, and correct me if I have the wrong impression here, but I recall that Roosevelt did have trouble building support for U.S. intervention in Europe in the early 1940s. And before Pearl Harbor, there was the Lend-Lease Act, which was a way of providing materiel to the British for their war against the Germans. And in retrospect, I view that as a first step, but it also appears that it was the only available option for FDR because of the strong sentiments against the U.S. getting into Europe's war.
And it took the bombing of Pearl Harbor to actually take the U.S. straight into the war.
Yeah.
But what happened at the around 1940 and 41, many of the people who had been anti-war activists in the League ended up going either being drafted or enlisting, including some of the pacifists at that time. And there were other conscientious objectors who went to prison. So a lot was going on. Jim had had polio as a child, and he was not, he had certain deficits that kept him from going to the war. And it was at that time that he joined UE News, that he joined the United Electrical Workers Union.
And this is something that most people have no familiarity with. At a time before broadcast had become big, radio followed by television, the various labor organizations had their own communications apparatus, usually in the form of a newspaper. So these are things that have fallen by the waysides as the labor movement has been marginalized and as electronic communications have become more favored by people. But we don't want to underestimate the impact of labor publications during this era when James Lerner was writing for UE News.
Right. And Peter, I would like to mention that UE News is still going strong. It still has its traditional tabloid newsletter that goes to the union members. And they did, by the way, a full-page spread when Course of Action came out with a review and a tribute to Jim. And so I also believe the International Longshoremen's Union still has a going newspaper for its members. So it still does exist today, not like it used to, but UE, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers Union, which otherwise known as UE, was one of the early industrial unions, and UE has a particular history that known as one of the most democratic unions, the most where the rank and file are involved, and no officer of the union, and the union was formed in 1936, no officer of the union gets paid any more than the highest paid worker within the union. And the union was known for one of the original unions to organize every worker under electric lights, meaning janitors to the craftspeople, was one of the most important, if not the most important, early industrial union that was known for its diversity and its philosophy of rank and file involvement, and it still does today. Anyone can go online, just Google UE News, and there it is. UE at its peak had 500,000 members, and at its lowest went down to something like 70,000. So that just gives one idea of the effect that the anti-communist witch hunts in the 40s and 50s, the effect they had on the labor union movement, which hasn't recovered to this day.
Just one more aspect of the American League Against War and Fascism, because the League embraced members from communist, socialist parties and others who may not have been well-defined. But how did they fare during the McCarthy era? Were they tagged as communists, as Red sympathizers, because they had opposed entry into World War II and the fascism that was rising in Europe?
In 1939, the FBI actually raided the League's offices and took out their membership list and leadership list of over 500 names. And started to target those people. You know, that was one of the reasons that the League fell apart. It was just began to be attacked both from outside and then the internal dissensions by the end of 1939. So that list that came out of the FBI raid in 1939 against the League went to the House Un-American Activities Committee. This story goes on and on. One of the League's main leaders ended up testifying for and working for the House Un-American Activities Committee and gave lots of names.
To the blacklist?
Yes. Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, one of the fascinating chapters in Course of Action relates to the conspiracy trial. And this had to do with what happened during World War II between America's General Electric and Krupp Industries of Germany. It was one of the big trans-industrial. They had many different kinds of operations in Germany. And in particular, they made armaments for the Nazi government and the military machine that Hitler built.
Not only was it a huge armaments manufacturer in Germany, but they were also involved in building the concentration camps and using forced labor from some of the camps during the war for their armaments works.
And so what is fascinating here is that Jim Lerner describes that after a couple of days of the start of this trial, he was the only reporter in the courtroom. And you would think that with a big American company accused of war crimes, or at least violating the wartime restrictions on doing business with Germans, that this would have been a major story.
It's important to put this in the context that something else was going on in 1947 that was attracting the mainstream press, and that was what was going on in Congress to pass the Taft-Hartley bill, which would require union leaders to sign anti-communist affidavits in order to hold office.
Right.
And it was a means to go after the unions for any kind of anti-communist sympathies, if not membership. And that's where the reporters were. However, Jim sat there day after day, week after week, and reported it in the UE News.
And Anna Marie, Jim writes that shortly after the trial was to begin, we ran a full-page story on the salient facts of the case. This is GE and Krupps, based on the 160-page indictment. The company accused the union of printing unproved charges of the indictment as facts and of being anti-labor because we were harming this great benefactor of the working man by printing such charges. This condemnation of UE News was distributed to all GE workers in the corporation's own newsletter called Work News. So we have kind of dueling print organs of the labor movement and big corporate interests as they're trying to say, you know, you're wrong, and GE was clearly very defensive about these issues.
Yeah. GE was found guilty of the charges of conspiring with Krupp. The federal prosecutor had actually asked for 6-month jail terms for the GE executives who've been involved, and, of course, fines and so on.
Yeah.
And the judge ended up, I believe the fines, even at that time, would not have been huge for a corporation like GE.
$56,000. Yeah. And let me read Jim's description of this. He says that the judge, named Knox, found the company guilty as charged. He then practically apologized for making the verdict and sentence by stressing that since the offenses of which GE was guilty were 8 or 9 years old, he personally had a very strong indisposition not to punish stale crimes too severely. Boy, that's double negatives. The judge then turned down the government's request that the defendants be given a 6-month prison sentence, and he imposed fines totaling $56,000, which is, even at that time, GE's profits for about a half day, maybe. So it's a very interesting case, and Jim Lerner had really the only perspective as a journalist covering the entire trial.
Well, that's a good reason why some of these memoirs that sit around people's attics or basements where people have lived in very important historical circumstances, it's worth pursuing. It took us years to finally bring it out, and we're very happy to have this experience coming out.
And finally, I want to focus on something you alluded to earlier, and it's the final chapter of the book, about how UE, this labor union, was very much against the war in Vietnam. And LBJ, when he won election, he had succeeded Kennedy in '63, and then he won a full term in 1964, had promised not to send any more American troops, and then he reneged on that in short order. And in the book, Jim Lerner describes the battle with the upper reaches of organized labor, because the UAW was, I guess Walter Reuther was supporting the war, and some of the other top dogs in organized labor were, I suppose, compromised by the fact that we had a Democratic president who was expanding a very unpopular war.
That's correct, Peter.
Well, it's a fascinating book, and in wrapping up here, what would you like to say about the legacy of James Lerner as captured in the book Course of Action?
Jim spent his whole life interested in social justice, in organizing, and I guess what he would really like his legacy to be is that's very important. That's if to achieve peace, social justice, not to be discouraged, keep going, keep using whatever organizing, writing skills one has to make a difference in terms of a better society. And we are still today facing those same issues, and the kind of organizing that James Lerner devoted his life to matter.
Yeah. Well, Anna Marie Taylor, thank you for joining us today. You are co-editor with Richard Lerner of Course of Action, published posthumously by James Lerner. And what's the best way for people to get a copy of this book?
The most direct way is probably to go to the website rnlpublishing.com. That's our website for the book, and it can be purchased directly from there. It's also at some bookstores and can be also purchased through Amazon, and it does have an ebook as well.
All right. I'll put up a link to rnlpublishing.com in the show file with this podcast at peterbcollins.com. Pleasure to meet you. Thanks for joining me today.